Many historians have been the World War II and as Many historian has been the World War II as in the effect is the reply of the WWI and with the Treaty of the Versailles in 1919 and marking the beginnings of the road and to the war. And in this the sense and the years of the 1919 and 39 and announced amount and to other treaty years and the truth and the criticism and of the Versailles and trained to the argument that it was the saved and by to the incompatibles and the objectives. The first was the attempt to create other liberals but and orders by the breakings and up to the European. Up to the European Empire and replacing and with them with other coalitions of the independence nation state policy and by the leagues of the nations and the world first attempt at the global government, the second expressed and in the particulars and by the France and the state and neighboring Germany and was decided to make the Germany and pay for the war and to benefit territorially and the economically and from its the defeats, and this led to the war and the gulf and clauses the loss of the German territories and on both the western and the eastern borders and to the impositions and of the reputations, and although it set out and to the redressed and the European balance of powers and Versailles therefore made things and votes the realist and the has often the follow the and 13 and and care in the argued and that are the major causes of the 30 years and crisis that led to the war in the 1939. 1939 vice vaders Bars and vaders and the faith is the closely muck. No. Oh. Nineteen 39 was the wider and with the utopians and or the liberals international the encourages and the have and the World War First and the victors and of the assures and there the international affairs and would in the futures be the guided and by other harmonies of interest and including the them to the disgraded and bits and for the powers and by the have not and in the particulars Germany and the Italy. The second major factor and that the helped to the foster intensified international tensions and in the Europes and was the global and the economically crisis in 1939 and 33 and sparked and by the ball street and craze of the culture of the October in 1930 1929 and with and this the highlighted and the both the highest levels of the inter connectedness of the global economics and throughout it is the repeat and the spread across the industrialized and world and structure instantly of its the financial systems in the particularly the main politically impact of the economic crisis was the rise in the unemployment and growing poverty and which in the politically and the unstable states such as the Germany invested in the radicals or the extreme political solution and with the great potencies and economically and the crisis result. resulted in the abandonment and of the free trade in the favors of the protectionism, and even in the 18th and the terms the turn to the economic nationalism and helping to the fuel the rise of the political nationalism and the international distrust. However, the main controversies and the surrounding the origin of the World War II and concern the role of the and significance of Nazi Germany, and historians have the disagreed and both the importance of the ideologies in the explainings and the outbreaks of the wars and can the German aggression and the expressionism and be the explained largely in the terms of the rise of the fascists and the specifically and Nazism and the extended into which the wars and was the outcomes and of the aims and the deliberate intentions of the adult and Hitler's and German the foreign policy and certainly becomes more than aggressive, and after the Hitlers and the Nazis comes to the powers in the 1939 and the Rhineland and was occupied in the 1939-36 and Australia was annexed in the 1938 and the Sudetenland and portions of the Czechoslovakia and was occupied, and the rest of the Czechoslovakia and invaded in the 1938 and 39. Then Poland was the invaded in the September 1939, and however the fact and that the fascism and the particularly Nazi ideology and blended and the social and Darwinism and with and the extremes and forms of the chauvinist and the nationalism and appeared and to the invest Hitler's and Germany with other sense of the Messiani or the of the fanaticals and the missions the protest prospect of the national generation and the rebellion, rebirth and of the national prides and through the war and the conquered. And on the other hand, and have the argument that the Nazi foreign policies and was the dictated and less by the ideologies and the more by the either and geopolitical factor or by other political culture that was the shaped by the 19th century and unification process, and from this perspective, there was the significant continuity between the foreign policy goal of the Nazi regimes and the preceding banners. Preceding and the Weimar and Republic 1919 and 1933 and the yearly and the Will Mainz and Germany the turns to the aggressive expressions in the 1913 and being the exemplificables and more in the terms of the opportunities and then the ideology, and however the unlike and World War I and World War II did not the originates and as other European and war and which the applied and overs and the affected and others the parts of the world and impact the development and look places in the Asias and notably and the linked and to the growings and powers and the imperial ambitions of the Japan in Asias and the notably and linked and to the growings and powers and the imperial ambitions of the Japan in many the ways the positions of Japan in the interwar and the period and resembled and that of the Germany and before the World War I and the growing economics and the limited military and strength of other single state and upset the continental balance of the power and help to the fuel expressionism and the tendencies. Japan bid for the colonials and the possessions intensified and in the 1920 and 1913 and in the particulars and with the occupations of the Manchuria and in the 1931 and the constructions of the puppets and state of the Manchukuo and in the 1936 and Japan and joined with the Germany and Italy and to the forms and the anti-Comintern and pact and which they developed into other full military political alliance. The Pact of the Steel in the 1939 and the eventually and the tripartite and Pact in the 1914. However, the expansionism and into the Asias and brought the growing tension between the Japan and the UK and the US. Calculating that by the 1941, it is the naval forces and in the Pacific and had the achieved and parity and with the those of the USA and the UK and taking the advantage of the changing focus of the wars, and once the Germany had invented the Russia in June 1941 and Japan decided deliberatively and to the provokes and the confrontations and the USA and into the World War II, and this the act and also the effectively and determined it is the outcomes end of the empire. Reparations and the compensation and the usually involving the financial payment of the or the physicals and the requisitions of the goods and the imposed by the victors or the vanquished and powers either and the punishment or as other rewards. A Turkey economically and the self-sufficiency and often the associated with expansionism and the conquest to the ensures the control of the economically resources and the reduce the economic dependency on the other hand. Focus on the Hitler wars. The debate about the Hitlers and the personals and the responsibilities for the World War II and has been the particularly and intense, and those who the subscribe and to the Hitlers and war the thesis and emphasis and the clears and the correlations and between the three aims and he set out and for the Germany's in the main camps in 1924 and the unfolding and Nazi expansionism, and in the 1913 Hitler and war aims were first and to the achieve the greater Germany and achieved and through the cooperation of the Australia and the Sudetans and Germans into the Third Reich, and second the expansions into the eastern through in the search of the living serum and or the living space and the achieved through the invasions and of the Russias, and third other bid for the world powers and through the defeats of the majors and seas and empirizes and Britain's and the US, and this the views and is also the supported and by the fact and that the Nazi Germany operated in the effects and as the Hitler state and with the powers concentrated in the heart of the single and the unchangeable leaders. On the other hand, and the opponented and of this the views and has the emphasis the limitations and of the great man theories of the history, in which the history is seen to be the made and by the leaders acting independently of the larger politicals, socials and the economically forces, and Marxists the historians and for the example have down and the attention to the extent into which the Nazi expansions and and coincided and with the interests of the German big business, and other have the draws and attention to the miscalculations and on the part of the both Hitlers and those who sought to contest Nazi aggressions, and the chief and the culprits and there are the usually identified as other lingerings and belief in the liberals internationalism and across much of the Europe, and which the blinds and state and man the generally to be the realist of the power politics and the UK policy of the appeasements, and which the encouraged Hitler and to believe that he could and indeed invade Poland without the precipitating and war and with the UK and eventually the USA. Concept world third world. The terms third world and draw the attention and to the parts of the world and that the during the Cold War and did not fail into the capitalism and so called the First World War and or the communist and so called the Second World War the less and developed and countries of the Africas, Asias and Latin Americas, and were the third in the sense and there they were the economically dependent and the often and suffered from the widespread and poverty, and the terms also the implied and that they known the alliance and the Third World War often and being the battleground and on which the geopoliticals and the struggles and between the first and second worlds and was conducted, and the third world has the gradually and been the abandoned and since the 1917 due to its the pejoratives and the ideological and implications and the resendings and the significance of other shared and colonial past and the economically development in the Asias in the particulars. End of the empires. 1945 was the turning point in the world history in other numbers of the respected and thus the includes and that it is the instigated and other process of the decolonizations and that the witnessed and the graduals and but the dramatics and the distinctions and of the European Union Europeans and the empires and not only did end of the empire and symbolized and the larger declines of the Europe and but it also the set in the trends and across much of the Africas and the Middle East or in the particulars and the politicals, economics and the ideological development. There were the goings and to have the profound and the implications and for the global politics the process and there whereby and the European control of the overseas and territories and the peoples and was gradually dismandated and had the begins and after the World War First and Germany was forced to give up it is the colonies and the British dominions and were the granted virtuous dependent in the 1931 and however the process accelerated and the greatly after the World War II and through other combinations of the three factors. First, the traditional imperators and power, especially in the UK, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and were the suffering from the imperials and over the reach and Kennedy in 1989. And second, other decisive and shift against the European and colonizations has the occurs in the diplomatic contact as a result of the ascending decision of the USA over the Western Europe and the capitalism and where in the generals and US the pressure to the dismantles and imperialism and becomes more the assertives after the World War II and more the difficult to the racist and third the racist to the colonialism and across the Asias, Africas and Latin America and become the free search and more the politicals and engage and this the occurs and is in part and through the spreadings and the influences in what comes to be the now and as the Third World War of the two sheets of the Western ideas and nationalism and the Marxism and Lenin in the combinations and thus the created the potential forms of the anti-colonial nationalism across much of the Third World in the pursuit and of the national liberations and the implied and not only the politicals and independence and but also other social and the revolutions and offering the perspective of the both politicals and the economically and the emancipations the end of the British Empire and which had the extended across the globals and it's the greater and extended and after the World War First and the extended and over the 600 and millions peoples and was the particularly and the significant India was the granted an independence in the 1947s and followed by the Burmas and the Sri Lankas in 1948 and the Malayas in the 1957 and with the UK Africans colonials and achieving the independence in the late 1950 and early the 1960 and by the 1980 and when the Zimbabwe firmly Rhodesia's and achieving the developed independence and the end of the British empires and had the brought and 49s and new the state and into the existence through although the UK had the constructed and military and the racist in the Malaya and the Kenya in particularly and the logic of the invitation tables and colonizations and was the accepted and meaning that the process was the generally and peaceful and this the contrasted and with the France experiences and where a the great determination to retain her and the imperials and status resulted in the prolonged and the ultimately fruitless and war to the racist and the Vietnamese and the independence 1945 1954 and the similarly and fruitless and the Algerians and war of the independence and the 1954 and 62 and the finals major European empires and empires to be the dismantled and was that of the Portuguese and which the occurred and following the overthrow and of the military dictatorships and in the Lisbons and in the 1974 in Africa final colony Namibia and the formerly and known as the Southwest Africa and achieved the independence in the 1919 and once the South African expected and that it the could not be and it's the war against the national and the liberations and forces it may be the possible and to the argued that the implications of the decolonizations and were more the profounded and then those of the Cold Wars and it's the certainly and the impact over other long period of times and in the first places The early decades after the World War II and witnessed the most and the dramatics and the intensities and process of the state constructions in the world history and the European decolonizations and in the third world and more than the retrieved and the memberships of the UN and from the about 50 states in the 1945 and to over the 150 states and by the 1978. This meant that the European state and the system and that had the originated and the end of the empires originated and in the 17th century and becomes either truly and the global system after the 1945. However, the end of the empire and also the significantly and extended the reach of the superpower and influences the highlighting the fact and that the decolonization and the Cold War and were not the separates and the districts process and but the overlappings and the intertwined and once the developing and world the increasingly and becomes the battleground and on which the east-west and the conflict and was the played out and in this the ways and the establishment and of the global state systems and the apparent and victories of the principles of the sovereign independence. Coincided and with other crucial movement in the advance of the globalizations and the absorptions and of the almost and all the parts of the world and to other greater or the lesser extended into the rivals powers blocks and this the process and not only the created other wave of the strategics and the military interdependence and but also the resulted in the higher level of the economic and culture penetrations and of the newly dependent state. Finally, the achievement of the formers and dependence and has had mixed consequences and for the developing world state in the terms of the economic and the social development. In the case of the so-called and tiger, the economically of the East and the Southwest Asias and many of the oil the producing and state of the Gulf and the regions and high the levels of the South of the growth and where the achieve and the vanishings and poverty and the bringings widers and the prosperities and despite the politicals and unfilled vanishings poverty and the bringings and the widest prosperities and despite the politicals and upfield and of the Mao and the period in China 1949 and 75 strategy levels of the economic growth and laid the foundation for the subsequent transition to other markets and economic and the rising growth and rates from the 1918 and onwards. The however and many others the areas and were less the fortunated across and what started and from the 1917 and to be the called the global south and she 360 and the most and the acutely and in the sub and the Saharan and African and the fourth and world and wide the spread and the sometimes and accurate the poverty and persistence rise and the fall of the Cold War. In the short 20th century and was characterized by the ideological battles and between the capitalism and the communism 1945 and marks other dramatically shift in the intensities and the scopes of this the battles and this the occurs and through and the important transformations in the world orders and through the badly and skins and by the World War first and having the experience economic declines and relatives and in the particulars and to the US, Europe and the European powers and has been and the major forces and shapings and world politics in the pre and 1939 and world the USSR as the superpowers and the predominated and the actors on the world stage and the apparently and the drawings and the great powers and of the old and the superpowers and eras was characterized by the Cold War and the period and marked by the tensions between and the increasingly and US dominated and the West and the Soviet dominated East and the multipolarities and of the pre-WW World War First, World War Second and period and thus gave way into the Cold War and bipolarities. The first phase of the Cold War and was found in the Europe and the division of the Europe that had the resulted from the defeat of the Germany's the Soviet Red armies having Red Army having advanced from the east and the USA and the UK and there the alliance and having the pushed forwards from the west and quickly and the become and permanent as the Winston and the Churchill and put it in his In his famous speech in the Fulton and Missouri in the 1946, and the Irans and the Curtains, and had the descended and between the east and the west, and from the Lubecks and in the northern Germany, and to the Testly in the Adriatics, and the sums the trace and bakes the start of the Cold War, and to the Potsdam and the conferences of the 1945, in which the witness and the disagreement over the decisions of the Germany and the Berlins into for the Jones, and while the others and the associates, and it with the establishment of the of the so-called and the Trumans and the doctrine in 1947, thereby the USA and committed itself to the supporting free pupils, and later the instigatings and the marshals and plans, and which the provided the economically support for the rebuildings and of the wars and towns and Europes, in the hope and that it would be the avals and to the racist the appears of the communism, and the process of the division and was the completed in the 1949, and with the creations of the two Germanys and the establishment of the rebels and the military alliances, and the consisting of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, and in the 1955 and the Warsaw Pact, and therefore thereafter the Cold War, and becomes the globals, and the Korean War 1953 marked the spread of the Cold War to the Asia, and following the Chinese Revolution of the 1949. How did the Cold War and start in the first places? And there is other little controversies and over the board and the circumstances, and that led to the Cold War in the line and with the assumptions and of the realist and the theorist and the superpowers and states, and the provided in the irresistibles and the opportunities for the aggrandizement and the expansions, and which made and the rivalry and the between the world and to the superpowers and the virtualities and the inevitables in the case of the USA and the Soviet Union, and this the rivalry and was the exacerbated and by their the common geopoliticals and the interested in Europe, and why the mutuals and deep the geologicals and disrupt and the nevertheless and significant debates and emerges and about the responsibilities and for the outbreaks and of the Cold War, and thus were the closely and linkage and in the rivalries and the ideological perspective, and that the help to fuels the Cold War itself. The traditional or the orthodox and explanations and for the Cold War lays the blame and the firmly aid the doors of the Soviet Union, and it sees the Soviet and stranglehold and over the Eastern Europe, and as and the expressions of the long standings and Russia's the imperials and invasions, and giving the renewed and the impetus and by the Marxist Lenins and doctrine of the worldwide and class the struggles, and leading to the establishment and the international communities. Concept superpower, the first use as the superpower and the William Fox in 1944, the terms and the indicated a the power and that is the greater than and a the traditional greatest powers, and for the Fox and the superpowers and the possesses and great powers and plus the great and mobilities and of the power, and as the terms and traits and to be the used especially and the refers to the USA and the Soviet Union during the Cold War period, and it is one of the more and historicals than the conceptuals and the significant to the describe the USA and the Soviet Union and the superpowers, and the implied and that they the post and first and the global reach predominated economic and the strengthening role and within their the respective and the ideological blocks sphere of the influence than the preponderant and military capacities, and especially in the terms of the nuclear weaponry. The notion of the Cold War and the suggested the condition of the neither and war nor the peace and the however to describe US-the-Soviet relation during this the period is the war and the Allies. The Cold War is to be the suggested that the level of the antagonism and between the two and powers and did show the deep and the impatience and that they would and have led to the direct military and confrontations and had the circumstances allowed in the practice and this only the applied and to the first and most the hostile phase of the so-called and Cold War and as the tensions and begins to the ease after the Cubans and missiles crisis of the 1962. The idea of the end and the enduring and Cold War and may the therefore and has been the shaped by the ideological assumptions about the irreconcilabilities and of the capitalism and the communism. Cold War. The Cold War was the supposedly and cold in the sense and that the superpowers and the antagonism did not lead to other fightings and wars and this the nevertheless and remains and true and only in the terms of the absence and of the direct military and confrontations and between the USA and the Soviet Union in respect of the covert and operations so-called the proxy and wars and conflict and that were the clearly linked to East-West and the conflict Koreans and Vietnam and the Arab and the Israelis and wars and so on. The Cold War was so. A revisionism and the interpretations and of the Cold War was the nevertheless and developed and there the attracted and growing the supports and during the Vietnam War in 1964 and 75 from the academic and such as the Gabriels and the Kalko in 1985 and this and the petro trade and the Soviet expansionism and into the Western Europe as the defensives and rather than the aggressives and the motivated and the essentials and by the decides and for other better for the buffer zones and between itself and other hostile based and either base and to see either permanently and weakened and Germany various post and the social and the regionalist and the explanations and have also have also been the developed and the sum of thus and the knowledge the hegemonies of the ambitions and of the superpowers and the arguings and that the Cold War and was the inevitable and consequences of the power vacuums and that was other product and of the defeat of the Germany and Japan as well as the executions on of the UK and Yargens. 1980 alternative as the explanations place other heavier and emphasis on the misunderstandings and the misses missed and opportunity. For example, there had been early and sign and of the hope in the presidents and the Roosevelt and belief in the peaceful of cooperation and under the species and of the newly creations United Nations and also in the stallions and distinctly and the discouraging and attitude and towards Tito and Yugoslavia's and the Mao in the China's and the Cold War was not a period of the consist and the unremitting and tensions and it went through other warmers and the coolers and phases and it the times and threatened to become other hot wars and the Cuban missiles and crisis of the 1962 and was the probably and the moment at which the direct confrontations and between the superpowers and comes closest and to the happenings and the fact that this exercise in the brickmanships and ended the peacefully and perhaps the demonstrated and the effectiveness of the condition of the mutually assist and the destructions in the prevalence preventing tension and between the super and the powers, and developing into the military and the confrontations. And however the bipolars and models of the Cold War and becomes the increasingly and less the equate and from the 1917 and onward. And this was due and first to the growing and fragmentations of the communist and world and notability and the dependings and the enmities and between the Moscow and the Beijings. And the second and to the resurges of the Japan and Germany as economy superpowers. And this was the reflected in the emerging and the multipolarities and of the 1963 and 71 period, and the more clearly into the era of the detentes and between the east and the west, 1917 72 and the 80 detente nevertheless and ended with the advanced and of the second Cold War in the 1980, which was the product of the reasons and the administration's military and world up and more the assertively and anti the communist and the anti-Soviet foreign policy. However, when the Cold War and come to the end, the end was the dramatics and the swift and the acute and the expected and over the 70 years of the communism and collapse, and in the just and 2 years and 1989 and 1991 and where the communist regimes survives and as in the China's other process of the radicals and the changes was talkings and place and during the momentous years of the 1989 and communist rules in the Eastern Europe and was rolled and back to the borders of Soviet Union in 1919 and the CSCE and Paris conference and the formally and announced the end of the Cold War and in 1991 and the Soviet Union and itself and the collapse and the nevertheless and debate about the end of the Cold War is the myriad and in is the much and the ideological controversies and as the debates and about its the origins, the range of the factors and that have been the associated and with the collapse of the communism and the end of the Cold War includes the following. The structures and the weaknesses of the Soviet style communism. Some have argued and that the collapse of the communication was and the accident and baiting to happens the inevitables and the outcomes of the structurals and flows and that the dominant Soviet styles and regime to the inevitables and the collapse and more the effectively than the contradictions and the identified by the Marx as the fatal flow of the capitalist systems. Was the Cold War in inevitables and debatings? There is always other tendency to read the eventualism into the historical event and that happened becomes they had to the happen and history has a predetermined and the courses in the case of the Cold War and this the debates and has the ranged and with other particulars patients and because it is the linkage to rebels and the theory about the factors and that the drive and the world politics and in the history and shaped and to the irrespectives and politicals or the ideological forces or is it too all to the often in the product of the misparticipations and of the miscalculations? Yes, dynamics of the bipolarities and the realist and the theories and hence the argues and that the Cold War is best understood in the terms of the powers and politics and the natures of the international system. In this, the views and stated are the pariparity and the concern and with theirs the avance and the survivals and therefore the prioritizings and military and the security concern. However, there the ability to pursue or the mentions maintain power is the determined by the wider than the distributions of powers within the international systems and what made and the Cold War inevitable and was that and thereafter. That after World War II and the defeat of the Germany and Japan and the Italy and the long-term declines of the victorious and states such as the UK and the France and created the bipolars and the world wars, bipolars and the world orders and in which the USA and the Soviet Union and the predominated and the influences the shape of the global politics in the post and World War II and era was the therefore clear and the bipolarities and meant that the rivalry and the hospitality and between the USA and the Soviet Union and was the inevitable and as each the south and to the consolidated and if the possible and extended it is the spheres of the influences and this led to the growing the enmities and between a the US dominated and west and the Soviet dominated and east. The world of the multiple great power had the givings and way to other world and dominated and by the two superpowers and peace and the cooperation between the thus and the superpowers was impossible. The ideological long war and the alternative versions of the Cold War in inevitability and the portrays and the ideology as the Stevens and the driving forces in this the view and the Cold War was the essentially and the expressions of the global ideological structures and between the capitalism and the communism and that the emerge in the 19th century and but the assumes and more the concern form after the Russian Revolution of the 1917 and the antagonism and between the capitalism and the communism and derived and from the fact and that the represented incapable incompatibles and modes of the economically organization in effect and the competitions and the visions of the futures and the Cold War was therefore the battles and the between the capitalism and west and the communist east and the USA and the Soviet Unions and beings and merely the instrumented and through and which it is was the fought and the world wars and thus and the becomes a the inevitables and once the fascism and had been the one accused in the 1945 and leaving the global politics and to be the structures and by the east-west conflict. Western imperceptions and about the Soviet Union and the Cold War was not the distracted and by the idea and the bipolarities or the ideologies and but comes and about the through the process of the mistake and miscalculations and the misinterpretations and both key and actors and blended in the missing opportunities and for peace and the corporations and the institute and the escalating mere subsumptions creating other mentalities and of the bombs and dollars and the doctrines and that made the mutuals and the suspicious and the ingrained and the hostilities and seems and the unavoided and about the western and the misperception about the Soviet Union and were the based on the assumptions that the Soviet foreign policy and was the determined and by the ideology rather than the territorials and the securities and the Soviet Union primarily concerned when the permanently and to the weaker Germany's and to create other buffer zone of the friendly and state in the Eastern Europe. However, by the 1946 and 1947 US, the policy and the analysis were the startings to see the creations of the Soviet and bloc as the either and the expressions of the deep-seated and Russia's the imperials and the ambitions on or as other manifestations of the Marxist Lenins and the doctrine of the worldwide and class the struggles and key features in the Truman's and the administrations come to the belief come to the belief and that they were the confederates of the Soviet Union went on the pursuing world revolutions and increasingly and acted accordingly. Soviet misperceptions and about the West. The Soviet Union, particularly and under the Stalin, and was the influences by the deep and the destructions of the West and born out of the interwar and fears about the capitalism and encirclement and the para links and the Western misperceptions on the Soviet leader and believed that the U.S. foreign policies and was the guided and more by the ideological consideration and particulars and anti the communism and rather than and by the strategics and the concern and thus the USA and repeatedly the reductions and the military and the presence in the Europe and US the forces and from the 3.5 millions and in the May 1945 से लेकर के 4 lakhs and the following March and the eventually into the 1800 and had the littles and or know the impact and on the Soviet policy makers and who the failed and to the understand that the USA and genuinely and wanted the cooperation after the World War II and the elevates on its the government terms and the mutual and interest and that the Soviet Union and the USA had in the stabilizing other possible and long-term relationship based on other shared decide to the reduced and there's the defenses and burden and the plug and resources the incident into the domestic reconstructions and thus the broadened to be the insufficiently and strong to be the content the draft towards the fear and the antagonism. कोल्ड वार का पीरियड 1945 से लेकर के यूनाइटेड नेशन क्रिएटेड जून 1945 हिरोशिमा एंड द नागासाकी एटॉमिक बम अटैक हुआ था अगस्त सी में हुआ था एंड 1946 में हुआ था न्यूरमबर्ग में टोक्यो में ट्रायल्स बिगेन एंड सितंबर 335 पे 947 में ट्रूमन डॉक्ट्राइन एंड अनाउंस हुई थी अप्रैल में 1947 में मार्शल प्लान एंड इंट्रोड्यूस हुआ था जून में 1948 से 1949 में हुआ था बर्लिन ब्लॉकेड एंड द एयरलिफ्ट एंड 1949 में हुआ था सोवियत एटॉमिक बम एंड द एक्सप्लोशंस एंड अगस्त 1949 में चाइनीज रिवॉल्यूशन अक्टूबर 1950 से 53 में कोरियंस वार एंड 1955 से 75 में वियतनाम वार 1956 से सोवियत इन्वेजन ऑफ द हंगरी 1961 से लेकर के बर्लिन वॉल इज द इनेक्टेड एंड द 1961 से लेकर के यूरी एंड गागरिन फर्स्ट पर्सन इज स्पेस. यूर गैगरिन इन फर्स्ट पर्सन इन स्पेस. 1962 से लेकर के क्यूबन मिसाइल क्राइसिस हुआ था 1967 में 6 डे वार हुआ था एंड 1968 में सोवियत इन्वेजन ऑफ द चेकोस्लोवाकिया में होता 1969 में अपोलो 11 लैंड्स ऑन द मून में होता 1971 में कम्युनिस्ट चाइना ज्वाइंस द यूएन 1973 में ऑयल क्राइसिस होता 1977 में इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म्स बिगिन इन चाइना 1979 में इस्लामिक रिवोल्यूशन इन ईरान 1918 में सोवियत यूनियन इन्वेड्स एंड द अफगानिस्तान 1980 से लेकर के 8 में ईरान एंड द इराक एंड वार हुआ था 1985 में हुआ था गोरबेचल बिकम सोवियत लीडर्स एंड 1989 में हुआ था बर्लिन वॉल हुई थी फेल्स द नवंबर 9 एंड CP 1990 में क्या हुआ था CSCE एंड मीटिंग्स एंड फॉर्मली द इंडेड द कोल्ड वार एंड द नवंबर 1991 में हुआ था कोलैप्स ऑफ द सोवियत यूनियन दिसंबर. Brinkmanships is the strategy of the escalating and the confrontations and events to the point and of the riskings and war and going to the brink and 8 other pursuings and the appointment to the back down. Mutually assured and destructions and made other condition in which other nuclears attacked by the either state and would only ensures it is among the destructions and as both the possesses and the eventual evaluations and the second history capacity. Been early sign of the hope in the president and result and belief in peace. The weakness were of the two kinds, and economic and the political. The economic weakness and where the link and to the inherent and failing of the central plannings and the centrally and the planned and economic the proposed and to be the less and effectively and then the capitalist and economic in the deliberatings and the general prosperities and the producings and modern consumptions and goods and eruptions and of the politicals and the disruption discontent in 1980s and 1989 1991 and where thus and in the sufficient insignificant and misers are the manifestations and of the economic backgoodness and the expressed a desire and for the western styles and the even and the living standard and the consumers and goods. The politicals and the weakness and derived and from the fact and that the communist and the reasons and where the structuralities and the unrespected responsibles and to the populars and the praisers in the particulars in the absence and of the competitives and the elections independence in the interested and the groups and either face medias and single the party communist and the states and the proposed and know the mechanism and for the articulatings and the political discontent and the initiatings and the dialogues between the rulers and the peoples. And there is the little doubt that in the additions and to the economic frustrations the populars protest and of the 1989 and 1991 period the articulated and the demand and for the kind of the civil and the liberties and the political right and that were seen and as the beings and the common places in the liberals and democratics based. All those structurals and the weakness may the explain and the communism and the susceptibilities and to the collapse and they do not the explain the either it is the timings and or it's the swiftness and how did the economics and the political infrastructure rate and the accumulated and over the decades and spills and over and the cues and the downfall of the regimes and in other matters of the month or the even weeks and the answer lies in the impact of the reforms and that the Mikhail and the Gorbachev and the introduce. Introduced in the Soviet Union and from the 1985 and onwards and there were and there the key and the aspect of the reforms and process and the first and based on the slogans and the perestroika and the involve and the introduction of the element of market and the competition and the private ownerships and to the takers the long terms and the definees and of the Soviet central and planning drawing on the either experience and in the market socialism and the particularly in Yugoslavia and however the economic and the restructurings and under the Gorbachevs and had the disruptions and consequences and it is the replaced and the insufficient and but the still functionings and planned and economic and with one that the barely and the functionals and it all. The second aspect of the reforms and process involved there the dismantlings and of the restrictions on the expressions of the opinion and the politicals and debates and under the slogans of the glasnost and however the glasnost and merely have other political voice to the Gorbachev's and the opponent hand lines and communist and who the opposed any the reforms and that the might and threatened and the privileges and the power of the party and state elite as well as the radicals and the element and there the wished and to the dismantles and the appearances and of the central plannings and the communist and rule the altogether Gorbachevs and thus the becomes and the increasingly and the isolated and retired and from the reforms communism and into the more and radical changes and including the formal abandonment and of the communist party and the monopoly of the powers and the third and the crucial aspect of the Gorbachev's and reforms was the new approach into the relations and with the USA and Western Europe and the basic of the which was the abandonment and of the Brezhnev and the doctrine and it is the replacement and the so-called and the senators and the doctrine allowing the status and of the Eastern Europe and to do it and whereas their way and meant that the Gorbachev and the Soviet Union refused to the intervene and as one and the after the another's communist regimes and collapse in the 1989 and 1990 and the symbolized and by the fail on the of the Berlin Wall. Alternative explanations and of the end of the Cold Wars and the draw attentions and away from the international development within the Soviet Union and the communist bloc in the general and the focus instead on the changing and the content within which the communism operated and the chief external factors contributing to the collapse of the communism and where the politics and of the reasons and administrations and in the USA and the advance of the economically and the culturals globalizations the reasons and the administration and the contributions and to this the process and was in the launching the Second World War and by the instigatings and either revenue US military and world up in the 1918 and the particularly in the forms of the strategic defense initiative and SDIs and the so-called Star War initiative of the 1989 and whether intended or not and this the draw and the Soviet Union into and the arms and race and that it's already the fragile and the economics and could not the sustenance and helpings provokes and the economic collapse and the increase the pressures and for the reforms and the contributions on the economic globalization was that it is the helped to widen the differentials and the living standard and between the East and the West and while the progressive and the internationalizations of the trade and investment helping to the fuels and technology and the economics development in the US dominated and West from the 1970 and onward and it is the exclusions and from the global market and ensure that the Soviet and the dominated and Eastwood and suffers from the economic stage nation culturals and globalization and contributed into the process and through the spread of the radio and the televisions technologies and helping ideas information and image from and the apparently and fears and more the prosperous and west to the penetrate and the more developed and communist and society and particularly and those in the Western Europe and this in the turn and the furthers and flutes and discontent and breed the support and for the Western style economic and the political reforms the world since the 1990 a new world order the birth of the post and Cold War and the world was complied and by other wave of the optimism and the idealism and the superpowers era and had been the marked and by the East West and the rivalries and that the extended and across the global and the led to the nuclears and the build up and that the threatened and to the destroy the planets and as the communism and the collapse in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet powers and was in the retreat and both the domestically and the internationally and president and the Bush son of the USA proclaimed the emergence of other new world orders and although the ideas of other new world and the orders and often the lagged and clears the definitions and it is the undoubtedly and the expressed quantitatively and the liberals hopes and expectations and whereas the Cold Wars and had been the based on the ideological and conflict and the balance of the terror the end of the superpowers and the rivalry opened and up the possibilities of the tribal of the liberals and peace and the founded on other common recognition of the international norms and the standard of the moralities central to this emerging and world order World order was the recognition of the need and to the settle and dispute the peacefully, to the racist and aggressions and the expansionism and to the control and the reduce the military and the arsenals and to the ensures the just treatment of the domestics and the populations and through the respected and for the human rights. And as end of the history and the theorist and such as the Francis and the Fukuyamas in 1980 and 1991. Argued all part of the world and would now irresistibly and the gravitate towards other singles models of the economics and the political development and based on the liberal democracy, the post-Cold and wars and the world orders, the appearances into the past. It's the first and series of major tests and within the ease helping into the fuels and liberals optimism and the Iraq's and the annexations and of the Kuwait in August 1990 and led to the constructions and of other Broad-based and the Islamic alliances, and there the Thurog and the Gulf War of the 1991, and brought and about the expulsion of the Iraqi forces, the disintegration of the Yugoslavias and in the 1991, and which precipitated and war the between the Serbias and the Croatias, and the show the first use of the conference and on the security and the cooperations in the Europe's and CSCE and the renamed and the Organization for the Security and the Cooperation in the Europe and OSCE in the 1994 as the mechanism and for the tacklings and the international crisis, leading to the hopes and that it's the would and the eventualities and replace the both the Warsaw and the Pact and NATO. Although the CSCE and had been the effectively and the sidelines and by the superpower hostilities and the scenes and its the creations and at the Helsinki and conferences of the 1975, and it was the CSCE and had and brought other formals end to the Cold War and how was the yearly and the promises of the internationals harmonies and the cooperation and quickly the proved and to be the illusory and as new the forms of the unrested and the even instability then rose to the surface and stress and within the new and world orders and were the generated by the releasings of the tension and conflict, and that the Cold War and had the helped and to the keep under the control the existences of and the external trade and to it the international communism and or the capitalist and the encirclement and promotes international cohesion and gives the societies a the sense of the purposes and identity and to the some extent. To some extended and for the instant and the West and defined and itself and through the antagonism and the towards the East and the vice versa, and there is the evidence and that is many the state and the collapse of the externals and the threat and help to the unleash and centrifugals and the pressures and usually in the forms of the racials and ethnic and the regionals and the tensions and this the occurred and in many the part of the world and what in the particulars in the Eastern Europe as the demonstrated and by the break up of the Yugoslavias and the prolonged and the blood said and amongst the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims the Bosnians and war 1992 से लेकर के 5 and witnessed the longest and the most violence Europeans and war in the second half of the 20th and century and far from the stabilizing of the world orders and based on the respected and for the justice and the human rights the international community and stood by the farmers and Yugoslavia and until the Kosovos and the crisis of the 1999 and allowed the Serbians to wages the war of the expansions and the perpetrates and genocidal policies and the reminiscent of those used in the the World War II and nevertheless and thus the early trended and hopeful and less the hopeful and in the post-Cold War and world history and where the abruptly and disrupted and by the advanced of the global terrorism in 2001 9/11 and the war on the tenor. For many, the September 11, the terrorist and attack on the New York and the Washington and see the page 21 and where other defining the moments in world history and the point 8 the which the truth is the true natures of the post and Cold War and eras was the revealed and the beginnings of the period of the unprecedented and global strips and the instabilities and on the other hand and it is the possible and to the exaggerated and the impact of the 9/11 as Robert Kagan and 2004 and put in the Americas and did not the change on the September 11 it only the becomes and more the itself and the variety of the theories and have been the advance to explain the advance of the globals or the transnationals and the terrorism and the most influential and the widely discussed of thus and has been the simul and the Huntington's and the theory of the chess. ये एक पेंट ऊपर है, ये मोबाइल ले लो।
हेलो।
Theory of the class and of the civilization and the Huntington.
मम्मी रुक जाओ, बात करवा रही हूँ। ले जा।
Huntington 1996 and the suggested and that the 20 and the first century and the conflict will not the primarily and be the ideological or the economically and but the rather cultural and the conflict and between the nations and the groups from the different and civilization. In this the lights and the September and 11 and the so-called war on the terrors and that it is the unleashed and would be the sheen and the as the evidences and of and the emergence and the civilizationals and the structure between the world West and the Islams and such other view and suggested and there the origins of the globals and the terrorism lies in the arguably and the irreconcilable and the tensions and between the idea and the value of the western liberals and the democracy and those of the islams and the particularly islamics fundamentalism and islamic fundamentalism and to the establish the primacy of the religious and over the politics and however the views and that the global terrorism is the essentially other religious or the civilization issue the ignorance and the fact and there the radicals or the militant Islam developed into the 20th and the century in the very and the specific so politicals and the historical circumstances linked to the tension and the crisis of the Middle East in the general and the Arab world in the particulars. The key factor and that have the contributions built into the politicals and tensions in the Middle East included the following. The inheritance from the colonization conflict between the Israel and the Palestinians and the curse of oil, the rise of the political Islams, political instabilities in the Middle East and can be the tracked and back to the final demise and of the Ottoman Empire in the 1918 and this the led to the establishment of the UK and the France mandated and the treatyship over the Serbia's and Lebanon and Palestine and what becomes Iraq. Western colonizations and had other number of the devilings and the implications and for the reasons and it bred the sense of the humiliations and the disgraces and the particularly is it led into the dismantlings and of the traditional Muslims and the practices and the structurals and the including the Shari's laws and it the resulted. Western colonization had the number of the deliberatings and the implications and for the reasons and it had it bred other sense of the humanization and the disgrace and the particularly as it's the led to the dismantlings of the traditionals and the Muslim practices and the structure including the Shari laws and it resulted in political border and that the reflected and the interacted and of the Western powers and the show no the regard and for the fact of the histories and the cultures and the ethnicity and the authoritarians and the corrupt government and was the installed and based on the pro-Western and puppet and rulers although the mandates and were the gradually and given up the during and the 1913 and 1914 West and the influences and the remained the strong and the inheritances of the colonizations and was the difficult to the throw off. The establishment in 1947 and of the state of the Israel and was the perceived and by the surroundings and the newly dependent and Arabs the state and as and the extensions of the Western colonialism and the creations of the Western outpost and design into the weakens the Arab world and defeats in other successions of the Arab and Israel was the merely and depending the sense of the frustrations and the humanizations and across the Arab world and the politicals and the symbolic impact and of the Palestine's problems, the displacement of the 10 of the thousands and the Palestinians of Palestine's eruption after the 1948 and war and the establishment of the occupied and terrorism after the 6 days and war in the 1968 is the difficult to the overestimated and the particularly and across the Arabs and world and but also in the many the other and Muslim states and in the additions and to the breeding aid the fasting sense of the representations and against the Western and the influences that are the being seen to be the embodies in the state of the Israel, and it is also the made and it is the easier for the corrupts and the complacent and military and the dictatorships to come to the power and the remains and in the power the knowing and that they the could and also always and use the issues and of the Israel and the Palestinians and to the mobilize populars and supports on the face of it and the Iran and that the possessions and of the world largest and oil the reserve and could be other source of the political tensions and the instabilities and extend the credibilities and however oil can be the viewed as other sense on the middle and east and in aid the least and to the senses and first in providing and the regimes and in the world in the Middle East and either secures and the abundance sources of venue it is reduced of venue it is reduced the on the face of it and ideas and that the possessions of the world and largest oil reserves and could be other sources of the political tension and the instability and strength the credibilities and however and oil can be the viewed and as other cuts and on the Middle East in aid the least and to the senses and first in the providings and the regimes and in the Middle East and with other secures and the abundant and source of the revenues and it is the reduced and the pressures and for the domestic politicals and reforms thereby helping and the entrench and the complacent and the unresponsive and the government and oil the revenues and were also the sometimes and used to the world up the extensive and the military and security and the apparatus and which were used to the repress the politicals and the opponents and the content and the discontent and the monarchicals and the autocracies and the military and the dictatorships and thus the remains and deeply entrances in the middles and east and the second and drawback and of the oil and was that and is the guaranteed and the continuing involvement and in the middle east and of the western politicals and the corporates and interested and the concern to ensure the access and to the oil resources and the until and the organizations of the petroleums and the exportings and the countries OPEC and successes in the tripling and the price of the crude oils and in the early 1917 keeping oil the prices and low the together and with the fact and that the Middle Eastern was also and the important arenas and for the Cold War and the antagonism and this the help and to the fuel the anti-westernism and the sometimes and more the specifically and anti the Americanism and the while anti the westernism and was the expressed and during the 1960 and the 1970 in the form of the Arabs and the socialism and from the 1918 and onwards it is the increasingly and took the forms and of the religion and the fundamentalism political and the spiritual generations and through the constructions and of and the Islamic State and Jain the imputes and from the potents and mix of the naturals, the nationals and the frustrations and the political representation, cultural and the disjunctions and the social and frustrations and of the both the urban poor and the young and the intellectuals and in the 20th and the century Middle East and in its the earliest and forms. The Muslim Brotherhood and it is the movement from the being other non-violence and the puritanials and the movement to one that the increasingly and the advocated and violence in order to the racist and all the foreign and the ideologies and the construct the poor Islamic state, the profits and the influences of the political Islam, and was the sustainability strengthened and by the Iranian revolutions and of the 1979, and which brought and the hard and line and Shias and lyrics and the Ayatollah and Khomeini and the September 192 and to the powers and she the Iranis and the Islamic revolutions thereafter and the radicals and the Islamic groups and such as the Hamas and the Hezbollah and Party of the Good and tended and to the displays and the seculars and the based groups like the Palestine Liberalization Organization (PLO) in the leading the structures and against the Israel and the what was seen as the Western imperialism and the Al Qaeda's and the 295 and which the emerged and out of the Islamics and the fundamentalism and the resistances and the fighters and who fought the against and the Soviet and the invasions. Gara mein wo invaders of the Afghanistan in 1979 and 1806 and has the developed and into the foremost and the exponent of the global and terrorism increasingly and the mountaining direct and attack on the US targeted and through the 9/11 Al Qaeda's and not only the demonstrated and the new and global region of the terrorism, but also that in the 21st and the century and war can be the fought and by the non-state and the actor including the choosely and the organized and the terrorism and network and as well as why the states and after the 9/11 the USA approach into the war on the terrorism quickly the started and to take shape. It is the openings and act and the launch in the November 2001 and was the US led military assault of the Afghanistan and there the toppled and the Taliban and the regimes and within other matter of the weeks because the Taliban and was so the closely and the linkage to Al Qaeda's had the provided Osama bin Laden and his the followers and with the base and this were the attracted and the board internationals and support and the become and only the second examples and in which the United Nations and the endorsed and the military actions the first and one the wings the Korean War influences and by the idea of the neo and conservations. The strategy of the Bush and the administrations was geared into the largest restructurings of the global politics based on the need to address the problem of the recuse and state and the by the promoting the democracy and if the necessary through the prey and the imperative military and streaks and in the January 2002 and President Bush and identified the Iraq, Iran and the North Korea and as part of the axis of the evil and later the expanding and this to include and Cuba, Syria and the Libya and later the dropped and from this the list and however and it was the becoming and clear that the regimes and change in the Saddam and Hussein and Iraq was the administrations and next objectives and opposed and probably providing the basic for the larger and the democratics and the reconstructions and of the larger Arab and world this led to the Iraq this led and to the 2003 and Iraq and world and brought by the USA and the coalitions of the willing. Although the initial and goals of the military and the intentions in the Afghanistan and Iraq and were the speedily and the accomplished and the removals of the Taliban and the other overthrow of the Saddam and his the bassist and the resigns and the respectively the pursued and of the wars on the terror and become the increasingly and the problematicals and the both of the Afghan and the Iraqi war the turned into protected and counter and the insurrections and the struggles and highlighting the difficulties and involved in the modern and the asymmetricals and the welfares and discussed in the chapter 10 and the despite the improvement to the security and positions and in the Iraq in the particulars the establishment of the civil orders and the longers and return and proceed and of the state and buildings and even the national building military interventions and the orders and to the promotes democracy and was the widely and beeved as and the act of the imperialism and across the Muslims and words and the strengthening the anti-westernizations and the anti-Americanization and the fears and therefore was that the bar on the terrors and had becomes and the counters productives and threatening to the creates the rather than the resolve and the class of the civilizations and that was the flusings and the Islamist and terrorism shift in the Bush administration and approach into the war and on the terrors and where the evidences and from the 2004 and onwards especially in the attempt and to the ensures the investment and of the UNN but and more the significant and the affected. Significant changes and occurs and after the President Obama and come to the office in the 2009 and thus the involves and the in the first places a the reduction and the emphasis on the use of military power and the greater stress and on the buildings and of the US and Sophie. In the Sophie and the if phased and withdraw of the US and drops and from the Iraq and was the started and the Iraqi forces assumed the responsibilities and for the security in towards and the cities in May 2009. Important overtures and were also the made to the Muslims and would in the generals and the more the especially and to the Iraq and in the view of the its and the strengthened influences not least and over the Iraq and the belief and that it was the trying into the executions and the nuclear weapon and calling for other strengthening of the cross and cultural and understandings and the recognizing and the mistakes and of the past and the Obama's the administrations and the strategy also the attempt and to give the greater and attention and to the causes of the terrorism and the not and the merely is the manifestations and the advanced and long the standings and the sources of the resistment and the grievances and most the importantly and through the borders and international pressures to the resolve the Palestine's problems shifting balance and within the global. The post-Cold War period in the January and February 1991 say Gulf War in 1992 and the Civil War and break out of in the former and the Yugoslavia 1993 European Union created April and July in 1994 and the air wars. September and the apartheid and in the South Africa. and the 1996 Taliban siege and the power in the Afghanistan, and the 1997 and Asian financial crisis, and the 1999 and the Kosovo War, and the September 2001 and the September's and 11th and terrorist and attack on the USA and Fez, October 2001 and US led and the invention of the 2003 and US led invention of the Iraq, and 2008 Russia invaders and Georgia, and August to September 2008 global financial crisis depend. Shifting balance and within the global economy. Shifting balance and within the global and the economy. There is no the settled and view about the extremely and when the modern phase of the acceleration and globalization began the ideas and there the economic and the globalization and was the happenings. Was only the widening and the acceptance during the 1919, and however the origins of the and the contemporary and the globalization can be the trickles and back to the general and shift in the economic priorities and following the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and of the fix and the exchanges and the rate during the 1968 and the 72. The shift to the floating the exchanges and rate led to the pressures and for the greater and financials and deregulations and the converted and the International Monetary Fund IMF and the World Bank and to the idea of the so-called and the West and the Washington and the consensus and under which and many the parts of the developing and the world where the encouraged and to the adapt and the structure and the advancement and the programs and based on the rigorous and the and the sometimes and the danger disinterest and the applications of the free market and policies. The emphasis on free market and the priorities and was the most and the eagerly and the embraced and during the 1918 and by the Reagan administrations in the USA and the Thatcher's and government in the UK. In this the context the collapse of the communication in 1989 and 1991 has profound the economic implications and altogether and with the China's and openings to the foreign investment and it the dramatically and the witnessed and the parameters and of the international and the capitalization transforming the western economics and the ecosystems into the genuines and globals one and the nevertheless and stock and thereby the market based reforms and had very the different and the consequences in the different part and of the post communist world. In Russia, and for example, they led to the falling living standard and the steep and decline in the life and expectancy, and which the provided the basis and for other drift and bake the towards and authorizations and rule under the Putins and after the 1999 and how viewers and the balances has the continued into the shift within the new and the global economic globalization was the intrinsically and the linkage and to the growing economic dominances of the USA and US the influences over the IMF and the get and replaced by the World Trade Organization WTO in the 1995 and the World Bank and has been the decisive in the weddings and thus the institution unto the free market and free trade politics and since the 1917 and is with the UK in the 19th century and free trade in the late 20th and the early 20th and first century and has the provided and the USA and with the both new market and for its the goods and the sources of the chips and labors and raw material and by the 2000 and the USA and controlled over the 30% of the global economic and outputs and the emergencies of the USA and is the most and the significant actors and in the global economy and was linked and to the bargainings and power of the transnationals and the cooperation and TNCs and the major swims and with the subsidiaries and in the several countries and which are the thereby a world to the switch and the productions and the investment and to take the advantage of the most and the favorable economic and the fiscal circumstances, and by the turn of the centuries and TNC and the announced and for the 70% of the world trade, with nearly half of the world biggest and the 500 corporation and being the based in the USA. And however the benefits of the global capitalism and has not and been the equally and the distributed in the particulars and much and much of the Africa has the suffered and rather than the benefited and from the globalization other disproportionated, and the numbers of the Africans and remaining the uneducated and the undernourished and with the population also the suffering and the disproportionally and from the diseases such as the AIDS. The impact of the TNCS on the Africas and has often the overall and been the negatives and the leading for example and to the concentrations and of the agriculture on the productions of the case crops and from the exports rather than the meeting local needs and other the part of the world, and have the either and suffered and from the increased and instabilities and of the globalization in financial systems, or have the experiences and declines the growth and rate and through and the unwillingness and fully to the engage and with the neoliberals and or the market reforms the highlighted and the instabilities and of the global and economic was the demonstrated and by the financial crisis in the Mexico's and in the 1995 the Asians and financial crisis of the 1997 and 1990 and which affected and the tiger economics of the Southeast and the East Asias, and the Argentines and financial crisis of the 1999 and 2002, and which led to the severs and contractions and of the economic and 21st century and trend in the global economics, and have the perhaps been the dominated and by the rise of the new economic powers, and the most important of which are China's and India's, and in this the lights the most significant development of the post 1945 period and may turn out to be not and the rises and the fall of the Cold War and or the even the establishment and of the US and economic and the military and hegemony, but the process of the decolonizations and that laid the basis and for the emergence of the superpowers and of the 21st and the centuries, and if the 19th centuries and was the European centuries, and the 20th and the centuries and was the American centuries, and the 21st and the centuries and may turn out to be the Asians and centuries since the around the 1918, and when the effect of the transitions and from other common economic and to other market economic started to become the appearances, and China's as constituencies and the achieved and annual economically growth and rate of the more than 9% in the 2009. China and overtook the Germany and to the become the world and the world third largest economic, and if the growth rates and the persist, and it has been estimated and that it will the eclipse and the economic and mites of the USA by the 2027. Indian growth and level since the 1990 has only the been marginally and lower than the those of the China. The emergence of India as other major economic power can be the tracked and back to the economic liberalizations and of the 1918, and which gave impetus and to the impressions and of the new technology sectors of the economic, and the stimulated and the export oriented and growth in many the ways, and the global financial crisis of the 2007 and 2009 and both the reflected and the gave further imputes and to the shift in the center of the gravities and of the global economic from the west to the east. And not only was the crisis and the precipitated and by other banking crisis in the USA, and has brought and some the argues and the US and models of the entire enterprises and capitalism and into the questions, and but the evidences of the yearly economically recoverings to China's and the India's, and show the extent to the which does countries and the sum of the thus smalls and the neighborings and the economics and have the succeed in the decomprising and the themselves and from the US economy. Summary: the modern world and was the shaped and by other series of the development and thus the includes the finals and collapse of the ancient civilizations and the advantage of the dark ages, the growing dominance of Europe and through the age of the discovery and eventually and the industrializations. The advance of the Dark Age, the growing the dominance of the Europe through the age of the discovery and the eventually industrialization and the growth of the European imperialism. And WW World War First and was the meant and to be the war and to end all the wars and put and but within other generation and the World War Second and had the brokens and out the key factors and that led to the World War Second and include the World War First and peace, the settlements, the global economic crisis of the 1913, the programs of the Nazi expansions and sometimes linkage into the personal influences of the Hitlers and the growth of the Japanese expansion and sometimes the linkage into the personal influences of the Hitlers and the growth of the Japanese expansion in Asia. 1945 is commonly seen as the watershed in the world history and it is the initiated and to the crucial process and the first was the process of the decolonizations and the collapse of the European empires and the second was the advanced and of the Cold Wars and giving rise to the dipolars and the tension and between and the increasingly and US the dominated West and the Soviet dominated East and Cold War the below bipolarities and come to end the end and through the Western Europes and revolutions of the 1989 and 1991 and which the witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and this was the result. This was the result of the factors and including the structurals and weakness of the Soviet style communism, the impact of the Gorbachev and the reforms and process the adverse, the advent of the second Cold War and the wider and the implications and of the economic and the cultural globalizations, liberal expectations and about the post and Cold War and period and flourish the briefly and before being the confounded and by the rise of the forms of the ethnics and the nationalism and the growth of the religious and militancy and this the especially in the alliances in the forms of the 9/11 and the advent of the war or the terrors and which has the sometimes and been and seen as the civilizational and the struggles and between the slums and the best and power balances and within the global economics and have the shifted in the important ways and while the some have the linkage and globalizations and to the growing the economic and the dominated and of the USA and others they have the argued and that the global economic is increasingly and the multipolars and the especially and due to the rise of the emerging economics. Question for discussion: why and how was the Europe either dominated influences in the pre and 1900 and the world in what the senses and why was the Germany and the problems following it is the unifications and in the 1971 but was World War Second really the rerun and of the World War Second and would World War Second and has the happened and without the Hitler and was the rivalry and the tensions between the USA and the Soviet Union inevitably after 1945. Chapter number 3: Theory of the Global Politics. Theory of the Global Politics. Man made man in the authorities and who the here boys in the air are the distillizings there the frenzy and from the some academic scribblers and of other few and years back. M. Keynes and the General Theory 1936. Theory of the Global Politics. No one sees and the world just as it is the all of the us look and at the world and the through the wheel of the theories and presupposition and assumptions and in this the sense and observation and the interpretations and are the inextricably and broad and together and when we the look at the world and we are also the injured and in the imposing and meanings and on it and this is why and the theories is the impact and it gives the shape and the structure to and the otherwise and the shapeless and confusing the realities and and the most important theories as far as the global politics in the concern have come out of the discipline and of the international relations, and with has the spawned and the rich and the increasingly diverse ranges of the theoretical traditions, the dominants and the mainstreams and the perspectives and within the fields, and have been realism and the liberalism, and each the offerings are the different account of the balance and between the conflict and the cooperation in world affairs. And why do the realist believe that the globals and politics and characterized and by the unendings and the conflict, while liberals and believed in the possibilities of the cooperation and the enduring species? And why has the realist and the liberals and ideas and becomes the more similar and over times? And however, and from the 1918 and onwards, the especially and gaining the impetus and from the collapse and of the communism and the end of the Cold War, are the series of the new theoricals and boys and has the emerged, and thus new the boys and new the have the substantially and expanded the range of the critical perspectives on the world affairs, and once the dominated and by the Marxism and the tradition, and how have the theories and such as the new Marxism and sees social the constructionism and the post-structuralism and the feminism and the post-colonialism and the green politics and caste is the criticals and lens on the global politics, and the how do they the differs and from the one another's. And finally the emergence of the globalization and has the post other series of the new and the theoreticals and globals most the significant about the moral and the theoretical implications and of the global interconnected, and how it is the possible and to the things globally. Does global interconnected and the equals and that be the rethings and the excitings theories or the events and the abundant theoreticals and the paradigms altogether? Key issues: why has the released and the argued and that the world affairs and should be the understood in terms of the power and the self-interested? And why do the liberal beliefs and that the world affairs and are the wished in favors of the interdependent and the peace? And how have the criticals and theorists and changes the mainstreams and approach to the global politics? In what ways and may the criticals and theories and questions the natures and the purposes of theories? What are the empiricals and the morals and implications of the global interconnectionalism? And do the articles and the paradigms and help on the hinders understanding? Mainstream perspectives. The key mainstream perspective on the global politics are the realism and the liberalism and as the disciplines and of the international relation, and book the safe following the World War First, and it is the drew and the particularly having on the liberals and ideas and the theories, and especially the about the disabilities of the conducting and the international politics and within other frameworks of the moral and the legal norms. And from the late 1913 and onward, the such and the liberals and ideas and were the subjected to increasing and the criticism, and by the realist theorist, and who the highlighted and what they saw and as the incapable and the realities and of the powers and the politics. This stabilized and the international relation, and as other divided and the discipline other battle ground and between the liberalism and the realism, and with the letters and the increasingly and the dominating the academic study of the subject, and from the 1945 and onwards the however and this so-called and first and great the debates and within the IR, and has the refused to the stand and the streets, and by the 1917 and new the versions of the realism and the liberalism has the appearance, and the over times and the differentiated and between the thus and the mainstream's traditional has been the pluralist realism. sometimes called the political realism, and claims to the offers and the account of the world and the and affairs, and that is the realistics, and in the sense of that is the hard and heated, and a the realistic sense sees it is the devoid of the wishfuls and the thinkings and the deluded and the moralizings, and for the realist and global politics in the first and the last about the powers and the self-interested, and this is why and it is the often and the portrayed and portrayed as the power politics and model of the international politics, and as the Hans and the Morgan thews and the put it and the politics, and it is the struggles and for the power over the men and the what and whatever, and it is the ultimately I may be the powers is the immediately and goal and the mode of the acquiring mentionings and the destructings. It is the determined and the techniques of the political actions. The theories of the power politics is based on the two core assumptions and only 2000s. The people are the essentially selfish and the competitive, and meanings that the egoism and is the defining the characteristic of the human's natures, and the state systems operated in other contexts of the international anarchy, in that and there is no the authority higher than the sovereign state. The core theme of the realist and the theorian can therefore and be the seamed and up in the equations and egoism and the plus and the anarchy and the equals and the power and politics, and some have the suggested that this the so formulations and betray are the basic and the theoreticals and the fault and lines, and within the realism dividing it into to the distant and schools of the thought, and one of thus the classical realism and explain the power politics in terms of the egoism, and while the others and neo realism and or the structural reflects and more other different emphasis. Thus, alternative approaches and the rivals and rivers, and as the centuries and assumptions and of the realism are the common to the most realism and the theorist and the even the throg and the they may and the disagreed and about the which and the factor are the ultimately and the most important, and the key themes and within the realism are as follow: egoism and the conflict, and statecraft and the in the national interest, international anarchy and its implications, polarities and the stabilities and the balance of the power. Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 and 1527, and Italians, the politicians and the authors, the son of the civil and the lawyers, and Machiavelli knowledge of the public lives and was the gain and from other sometimes and the curious and existence in the politicalities and the stables and Florences, and as other servant of the Republic of the Florences, and he was dispatches and on the diplomatic admissions and to the France, Germany and the thought out and Italy, and after other brief and period of impressionments and the restoration of the Medicians and rules, and the Machiavelli and retired and into the private lives and the embarked on other literacies and careers, and his the major works and the prince and returns and in the 1513, and but not the published and until the 1531, and the scene is the classic realism and analysis of the power politics, and draw the heavily and on his the first and observations and of the state craft of the cases and the Borgias, the discourses on the returns and overs other 20 years period, and nevertheless and portray him as a the republican, the adjective and the Machiavellians, and the fairly on the unfairly and the subsequently, and come to the means and cannings and duplicitous state egregious and conflict in basing there's the theory in basing there the theories of the politics and on other pessimistics theories on the pessimistics and but the allegedly at the realistics and the models of the human nature and classical realistic can have the worked and within other long and the established traditions of the thought and which can be the tracked and back to the theosided amount of the Paponiums and war and the to the Sun Taju classicals war on the straight and figures include Machiavelli and the Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli. Machiavelli and the Thomas Hobbes and the Machiavelli theory of the politics and was based on other darkly and narrative negatives and models of other changeless and humans and natures and in his the views and humans are the insatiables and the oriented and crafty and shifting and the above and all the malignant and the iniquitous and the violence and savage on this the basis and the Machiavellis and argued and that the politicals and life is always and characteristics and by the inevitables and the safe stripes and encouraging the politicals and leaders and to the rule and through the use of the cannings and crudely and manipulations and hopes and thinkings and was also the based on other pessimistic view of the human natures and he the argued that the human are the driven and by the non-nationals and the appetites and the aversions and fears the hopes and the desires the strongest of the which is the desires and for the powers and after the power as no the single power person or the groups in strongs enough to the established and the dominances and the therefore other system of the orderlies and rule over the society other condition and that the hopes and the referees and to as a the state of the nature and the ongoing and civil wars and developed and between all member of the society and life in this the state of the natures and could thus and be the solitary and the poor and nasty the brutish and the short and according to the hopes the only and ways to of the escapings and from the barbarities and of such other society and would be the through the establishment of the sovereigns and the uncles and the jewels and powers and that is by the creations and of the state and how did such and the thinking and shape the understandings and of the international politics in the first place as the realist and accepted that there are no forms of the world and the governments and can ever be the established and it is the mean and that the politics is conducted and within that what is in the effect and the internationals and the state of nature and the international arenas and is therefore the dangerous and the uncertain with orders and stabilities and always the beings the exceptions and rather than the rules and second the whereas and the Machiavellis and Hobbes and were the primarily and concern and to the explain the conduct of the individuals and or the social group and the realist and international and the theorist and has been the concerned and above all and with the behavior of the state and realist and view the state and as the cohesives and units and the regard on them as the most and important actors on the world stage and realist theory of the international politics. State of the nature a society and devoted of the political authority and formal check on the individuals. Human nature approach to the human nature realist view on human nature is the starting point and for much the realist analysis and so much and so that the classical realism has some the times and been the portrayed and is the biological realism and influences by the thinking and such as the Hobbes and Machiavelli and realists have embraced and the theories of the human natures and that has three the main features and first the essentials and core of the human's natures and is the fixed and giving the fashions and by the nature and belongings or the genetics and the factors and rather than by the nurtures and the influences of the educations and or the social factors and the generally second instinct and the ultimately prevail over the intellects and the human beings, and are the driven and by the non-rational appetites and aversions and the fears and hopes and the desires, and the strongest of the which is the desires, and to the exercise and powers and over the other intellects and the reasons may the quiet and us in the pursuings, and thus the appetites, and but they do not the defines and them in the first place, and third is the human beings and are the essential and self-seeking, and the egoisticals, and the conflict between and the amongst and them is and the unavoidable and fact of the life, and for the classical realism, and this the human egoism and the determines and state the egoism and the creations and the international system, and that is the inevitabilities and charter and the characterized and by the rivalries and the pursuits and of the national interest and hopes for the international cooperations, and even the perpetuals and the peace are therefore the utopians and the delusions, and however the assumptions and about the human natures and are the peripherals and with the neorealism, in which the rivalries and the conflict is the explained and in the terms of the structures and of the international systems, and rather than and the wake up of the individuals and therefore of states. Liberals views and the liberals and have other broadly and the optimistic and view of the human nature, and the humans are the seekings and the largely and self the religions and creatures, and but they are the also and the governed by the reasons and are the capable of the personal self development, and this the implies and on the one hand and the that there is and the underlyings and the unavoidables and the tendencies and toward the rivalries and the competitions and amongst the individuals and groups and in the international arenas and state and however on the other hands, and this the tendency and towards the rivalries and in the continent and by and the underlying and faith in other harmonies of the interested and conflict can and the should be the resolves, and why other preferences and for the resolving the conflict and through the discuss and debates and the negotiations, and the liberals and therefore typically and deplores the use of the force and the aggressions and war. For the example is the inevitability and seen as and the options and of the very last and resort. In this the view the use of the force and may be justified and either on the grounds of the self defense and or is the a means of the countering and the operations, and but the always and only the afters and the reasons and the arguments and have the failed and by the contracted and with the realist and image of the humans as the ruthless and powers the maximizers and the liberals and emphasis, and that there is other moral dimensions to human natures and most the commonly and reflected in the doctrines of the human rights, and this the moral dimensions is the granted in other strong faith in the reasons and the progress and reason the districts, and there the human beings and the street is the traits and each others the with the respected guided and by the rationalities and based the rules and the principles, and it is the also the emphasis and the scopes and within the human beings and for the personals and developments, and is the individuals and the expanse and there the understanding and the refines, and there's the incivilities and thus for the socials and programs and critical views, while both realism and the liberals and tend to the belief and that the core and the aspects of the humans and nature and are the unchanging and the fixed, and aid the birth and the criticals and the theories and generalities and views the human nature as the plastic and the molded and by the experiences and the circumstances of the social lives in the nurtures and the natures and debates, and they therefore and tend to the favors and nurtures, and this has to the key and the implications, and the first and it is the suggested a the unifying and visions of the humans as the socials and the creations and the animated and by other common humanities, and the therefore and the cosmopolitias and the morals and sensibilities and the criticals and the theories, and for example are the often and willing to go and the further than the liberals internationals nationalist and in the endurings a one world and the visions and grounded and in the ideas and of the globals and justice, and the second implications and of the cities and is that and it is the highlighted the extended to which the economic politicals all the culturals and the structurals and save the human's identities and wants to and the perceptions, and as the Marxist and has put it, and the social being that determines and the consciousness and for the social constructivist and the post structuralism, and this may the suggestion that there is no the such and these things as the human natures and in the sense of other state of the avoidings and tendencies or the dispositions, and that the apply in all the circumstances and all the societies, and feminist and usually the embrace and the androgynous and the models of the human natures, and implies and that the women's and men the shares are the common human natures, and that the gender differences and the social and the culturalism and the imposed and difference and feminism and the nature as wealth and hold that, and there are the deep rooted and the perhaps even the essentially differences and between the women and the men, and such that the men are the disposed and to the competitions and the dominations, and while the women are the naturally and the sympathetics and the peaceful are thus the firmly state centric, and third and the crucial is the fact and that the state are the composed of the led and by the people, and who are the inherently and the selfish, greedy and the power seekings and mans, and that the state behavior and cannot but the exhibits and the same and characteristics and human the egoism, therefore the determine and state the algorithm or as the more Thews and 1962 and put it is the social worlds and what are the projections of the human natures and onto the collectives and plans, and just as the human egoism and leads and to the unendings and the conflict among the individuals and the group and state the egoism, and means that the international politics is marked and by the inevitables and the competition and the rivalries, and as the essentialities and self the interested and actors the ultimate the concern and of the each state and is for and the survivals, and which the their wise becomes the first and the priorities and of its the leaders, and as all the state and the pursues and security and through the use of the military and or the static means, and the bears the possible senses to the gains and advantages and at the expansion of other the state and international politics is the characterized by and the irresistibles and tendencies towards conflict. 82. Thank you, as this session will be closed.